With me today is Shruti Shah, entrepreneur resident at the Silicon Valley Bank, which is a big title.
I guess it is a big title.
No, but you've done a lot of previous interesting things that I know some people that are familiar with you would be familiar with. And so we'll get into some of those, but I wanted to kind of drill it back a little bit more earlier in your life. Talk to me about growing up. Grew up in Memphis.
Yeah.
Interesting family background.
Yeah, of course. So I grew up in Memphis, but I was adopted. So I was born in India, and my dad's brother's wife and my dad's brother are my biological parents. And my parents adopted me when I was 11 months old. But I guess the difference is that my adopted family is half white, half Indian. So my mom is a Jewish New Yorker from the Bronx. So I grew up Jewish in the South. I went to an Episcopal all-girls school until I was in 8th grade.
Wow.
And yeah, had a lot of different culture, I guess.
Wow.
That was part of my life.
So how did that, so growing up, so mixed race family, adopted, in the South,
Yeah.
Episcopal all-girls school.
Oh yeah, and the other kicker is my mom was the breadwinner in our family. So she was a lawyer and she worked full-time. My dad worked part-time and was an architect and then eventually stayed home with us. And so my family was just weird. We were very different.
Did you notice the difference? As you say, weirdness?
I definitely, I think I did notice the difference. I don't think I knew it was because of that.
Okay.
Like I think as a kid growing up, I was very aware that we were different, but we didn't call out like that was the reason that we were different. I just felt kind of out of place because I wasn't around people that looked like me. I was going to synagogue or Bible study or, any of these other things that like were definitely with people that didn't look like me.
Yeah.
And so I think that was hard.
Yeah. But you did have chances to travel back to India.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So, when I was a kid, we only went back twice.
Okay.
I've gone back a lot more frequently as an adult, but I think, I think it was a real, particularly as I got older, I think I started to realize how different my life would have been. I have a pretty clear sense of how my life would have played out in a different context.
Yeah.
And I would have grown up in a lower middle class Indian family, which, would have been fine. But in terms of just access to opportunity, I think 4 people made a decision and totally changed my life outcome.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so how old were you when you moved to the United States?
11 months.
11 months old.
Yeah.
And your first time back was at 7?
Yeah.
Wow. So talk to me a little about your experiences and are there any moments that you can draw back on that were formative in how you think about the world, how you think about community? You've experienced different communities.
Yeah.
But just your perspective on people and community and some moments that might have helped shape that.
I think there's a few that I can remember really distinctly. My aunt, my dad's younger sister, not my biological family or my biological parents, she was an executive at IBM. And I once went to India, I think when I was in college, and she was basically managing one of the call center operations in Bangalore. And I remember that she took me to kind of get coffee in one of these coffee houses that sits in between kind of the different companies that have call center complexes there. And we started talking about kind of the demographic makeup of people that work in these call centers. And many of them have college degrees. They were probably about my age or a little bit older. And I think that's when it really hit home for me that like opportunity is really different in different places and access to opportunity is really different in different places. And a lot of that is shaped by the community that you grow up in and kind of the social capital that you have access to. But yeah, I think more broadly for me, like I grew up in a community that was very mixed race, where my family has friends from a lot of different backgrounds, and friends who I think in many cases are family because we don't have a big family that lives here. Most of my mom's family was killed in the Holocaust, so she has a pretty small family, and most of my dad's family lives halfway across the world. So I think what that enabled me to do was really move through different types of communities in different ways, like kind of be a chameleon in some sense, and relate to people from a lot of different backgrounds.
Yeah. How did that make you feel? Because I think there's a point of which I'm listening to you, and it's awesome. The perspective you have, I'm sure it's built a lot of empathy for others and just their own experiences and seeing them and like, you know what, that explains why this occurs or why they think this. But you mentioned chameleon. I mean, how does that make you feel insofar as wow, what a diversity of experiences before you even go to college.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think it's always been hard. I mean, I think part of what's hard about it is that you don't ever really feel like you fit, like, that you don't have a strong identity, that kind of puts you in a certain box. In some ways that can be really powerful. I think in other ways, sometimes finding your people or finding, where you feel like, you can make a difference in the world or where other people get you.
Yeah.
That can be a challenge. And I think, I've slowly gotten there. I feel like I pick people up, in different parts of my life and, kind of have built community that way.
That's neat. So I'm the father of adoptive girls.
Oh, cool.
So yeah. And so I'm listening to you talk, and those are many of the things that my wife and I talk about a lot. It's just, how do we navigate this, celebrating their culture, talking to them about who they are and what that means.
Where are they from?
They're originally from China.
Okay. That's really cool.
So it's fun, but it's also hard.
It is really hard.
Yeah.
We could have a whole podcast
on
adopted kids.
Just adopted kids.
I have so many thoughts. I think my parents were not we did not do a lot of Indian cultural stuff. Yeah. I mean, my dad is Indian, but I think he came to America because he wanted to be American. So it was like not top of mind. And my mom was really, I think, intent on us being connected to her family and her parents and Jewish identity. So I didn't really grow up with a lot of an Indian identity, which I think now is kind of strange because people make a lot of assumptions about my skin color and my name and all of the experiences I may or may not have had. And so that can be interesting. But
it's hard to be like completely seen in the midst of all that. So, so you describe a chameleon. So your career's been somewhat chameleon too.
Yeah,
so
it totally has been.
So you're a Tar Heel.
Yes.
And then you go from UNC and you work with Teach for America. Mm-hmm. And then you go from there to an ed tech or a VC firm, and then ed tech, and then the company that you're known for.
Yeah.
Talk to me about those experiences, and specifically Teach for America, the challenges that it taught you, and how you carried those forward into the business world.
Totally. So many challenges. Well, I decided I wanted to go into teaching because I really thought that the career that I wanted was going to be in government or policy. I studied social entrepreneurship in school, but I really thought, the way to make change is like to do the hard work of, working in the system. And I thought teaching experience would be really valuable. And I wanted to understand more about the education system. I think I went to a public high school in Memphis, which is still a deeply segregated school district. Have always been really interested in public education and the role that public education plays in kind of creating democratic societies. And I wanted to be kind of part of that process. So I joined Teach for America, and I taught in Baltimore, which is probably one of the hardest places in the country to teach. And I think for a variety of reasons, decided to leave the classroom after a couple of years, namely because I didn't think I was a great teacher. But I learned a lot in that process. And I think probably most importantly, like everything I thought I knew about education kind of got turned on its head. Many of the students that I taught were dealing with real socio-emotional challenges. They didn't have proper access to healthcare. They were in some cases malnourished. They really were struggling, I think, to survive in a system that really was pretty powerless in being able to help them. And I felt pretty powerless as a teacher. And I think the demands that we put on teachers too have gotten to be quite complicated, just in terms of what's expected, particularly in an environment where students don't have access to a lot of resources. So while I was teaching, I got really interested in the role that technology could play for my students and actually being transformational. Teach America talks a lot about transformational change. I think I feel very much like I've lived transformational change just by kind of the very nature of the life that I've been given. And I really felt like if I couldn't fix all these other problems, like maybe technology was a way out for some of my students. So I used a lot of cool tech tools in my classroom. I helped train other teachers. And my hope was that some of these cool products and services that I had found, many of which were located in Silicon Valley, could provide kind of the resources and educational training that a lot of these students might need to be able to get jobs or kind of get themselves out of the system or the cycle of poverty that they might be trapped into. Very idealistic view of the world, but nevertheless, I decided to leave the classroom after 2 years, and I joined an early stage education technology venture fund that at the time was really focused on helping entrepreneurs sell their products directly into schools, which was very mission aligned for me because I believed very strongly that for many of these products and services to get to the kids that really needed it, they need to be in school districts. And so I was there for about 6 months and got to see some really cool products, meet really amazing entrepreneurs, but they slowly decided to change their strategy. And they were focused instead on helping entrepreneurs basically just sell direct to consumer because selling directly into schools is hard. You have to have a sales team.
The cycles are long.
It's a complicated process. And around the same time, I had been working on an idea with a couple of my friends. Basically, we had all moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. I'd sold all my furniture in this townhouse in Baltimore that I was living in on Craigslist and thought, wow, this is incredibly inefficient. And then bought pretty much the same stuff in San Francisco and basically, decided that maybe this was a problem worth pursuing. So we all had kind of different experiences. My 3 other co-founders had moved from Minnesota, New Hampshire, and Texas. And I don't think any of us were like super excited about staying on in our roles. And so one day we just quit. We raised money on an Indiegogo campaign and we started emailing people on Craigslist, telling them that we would pick up their stuff. And we found a warehouse space in San Francisco where we stored all this furniture.
Wow. And so that became Move Loot. And Move Loot, you guys ended up raising $22 million.
Yes.
And then inevitably closed your doors.
Yeah.
But I mean, not like raise $22 million and then close your doors.
We took the money home. No, we didn't.
But you kind of rode the roller coaster.
We definitely did. In about 3.5 years, we built this really large business, and then very quickly the whole thing fell apart.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to share more about that. But
I'm not so much like the mechanics of what happened, but I think sometimes, so we're in Louisville, Kentucky right now, and you were doing this out of Silicon Valley. And I think the culture of failure that I see in the Valley is one where it's accepted. It's just part of the narrative. But in communities where capital is scarce and opportunity is constrained, failure is not an option. And so it creates this culture of fear of failure. And so, as you know, talking to an entrepreneur here, or talking to an investor in a community like Louisville, Kentucky, or St. Louis, or Memphis, where you're from, what could they learn from your experience that would be helpful for them in starting out or recognizing, okay, it could fail. Mm-hmm. That's a real thing. How did you get comfortable with that notion? Even though you were in the midst of Silicon Valley where that's accepted, how did you even think about that? Or is it just, we just got going and
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a lot of things that I feel like I've learned from that or that I could impart as wisdom potentially. But I think the biggest is that, one, you can fail and be okay.
Yeah.
I think I didn't believe that when we were building this company. And certainly when we shut down the business, I certainly went through a number of months of like severe depression, and thinking that, I'd certainly ruined it this time. But I think the reality is that a lot of this is, what do you do with the experience of something like that? If it doesn't work out, how do you think about the lessons that you've learned and use them to be able to do it better the next time, or to let it lead you to what you want to do next?
Yeah.
I also think that something that's important in my mind is for entrepreneurs to think about how to speak up and own their own destiny. And I think oftentimes in dynamics with investors, especially investors that might have invested in more companies than you have, or they've seen more companies than you have, and they have more experience than you do, I think it's tempting to just kind of listen to what the person sitting on the other side of the table has to say, instead of listening to your gut. At the end of the day, you're running your business, and people are going to give you a lot of advice. But if something doesn't feel right, there's probably a reason why.
Yeah.
And you should probably follow that instinct.
And it sounds like those two things, if I'm following your bio, have really kind of led you to what you're working on right now.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to me about what project you're working on right now and kind of where you are in the midst of that.
In the midst of it. So kind of based on my experience with MoveLoot, I have been developing the idea for a new asset class. I don't want to call it a step fund, but the idea behind it is that I believe we need a middle of the road solution that exists in between venture capital and traditional debt financing, to help businesses grow profitably and sustainably. And then in our case, that is biased towards women, people of color, and people that are running businesses outside of the Bay Area. Access, I think, has been a theme of my life, and creating access to capital for people that don't have it is really, really important to me. But I think even more importantly that, I think creating opportunity by way of ownership is also really important. And so the way our model will work is that we would make an equity investment in a company, and the company would use revenue to buy back the equity, so that the founders maintain more ownership in the business over the long run. And the goal isn't to grow a huge, big business. It is instead to build something that's profitable.
So in that scenario, the investors can still win, they get their return, but the entrepreneurs can win as well.
Yep.
And so what a neat strategy. You once said, and I think it's somewhat related to that, this notion of access and opportunity. A quote that I found is, as I've grown up, I've found increasingly that the communities that I'm a part of are largely dominated by people who don't look like me.
Yeah.
As a result, I found myself in many uncomfortable situations where I'm the token person of color or woman. In those roles, I become the default advocate for inclusivity, or the person calling out racism and sexism when I see it. Perhaps at times to the discomfort of those around me. I've been given a seat at the table because my experience and education have afforded me the ability to code switch. And I'll jump ahead, but at times, being the token leaves me feeling defeated, exhausted, and frustrated. I want to ask kind of two questions with that. How have you been able to overcome those feelings? Because I can only assume that those can be deflating experiences. I'm a white man, so I don't share those experiences, but I can hear in those words just an exhaustion.
Yeah.
So how do you overcome that? And then second is how can we create more room at the table?
Yeah. I think those are two really good questions. I think when I wrote that, I was feeling particularly defeated.
I'm glad you're beyond that, so we can talk about it.
Yeah, of course. But I think, I think there's a number of ways that you kind of move past that. For me, it's been being able to find communities of women and communities of people of color who are also going through similar things, whether it's other entrepreneurs or other investors, people that you can kind of vent to and talk to about this stuff. And then I think it's also about finding people who can be real advocates. I am fortunate enough to work in a place, Claire Lee, who's the head of the early stage banking practice at SVB, she's the one that created this role for me at SVB. And she is an incredible advocate for women and people of color and, founders who are atypical, I guess you could say. And I think without her, having someone, not having someone like that be an advocate for you, I think can make things really, really difficult. So I've been fortunate that I've had that in my career, where I've had people who've kind of taken me under their wing or really been an advocate for me.
That's great. And then on the second question of how do we move towards more authentic engagement and use our privilege for the sake of others? How would you're talking to me,
yeah,
a white man. How can we work towards more breaking down the power dynamics that we kind of were talking about a little bit around venture capital? Those exist in a lot of ways. How do we break that down?
So I think there's two things at play here. I think there's one, the interpersonal piece. So as an entrepreneur, how do you fight bias in the system on a daily basis as an individual, which I think is a much harder question, because at the end of the day, in many of these cases, you're subject to kind of the power dynamics at play.
Yeah.
And it's hard as one person to kind of fight the system. I do think there is a lot of really interesting stuff happening now, just in terms of information sharing, particularly between entrepreneurs, where people are more willing to talk about their experiences, and as a result, know, if and when there are bad actors, or know who can be really I think on the more positive side, who really is an advocate and who can be really helpful. But the second piece to that, I think, is more systemic, which, I would talk about kind of the need for systems change, both in tech, but I think more broadly just in business. Many of our I guess institutions or workplaces are still have policies that I think are somewhat outdated when it comes to paternity and maternity leave, when it comes to childcare, when it comes to healthcare. Just thinking about the ways in which you can create a work environment that is one that is accepting of a lot of different types of people, a place where lots of different types of people want to come to work, is, I think, something that people don't do from the very beginning. It's something I find a lot of entrepreneurs don't think about when they're building businesses from the ground up. So I think what would be really cool from my perspective is, as a venture capitalist, thinking about how do you equip entrepreneurs with the skills that they need to build businesses that are culturally responsive and that are thoughtful about, the needs of different types of employees as the company grows, and that they're doing that from the very beginning.
That's great. That's really helpful. So I want to go back to something you said just a couple minutes ago about the STEP fund and this new asset class. So you call it a middle of the road. So it sounds like you still feel like there's room for venture, but there is a need for something else.
Yep.
That what we've done over the last several decades is just kind of, this works, and it becomes the gold standard, if you will, where we don't deviate from it. So is that something that you believe? Do you believe there still is kind of, there's going to need to be multiple buckets of that entrepreneurs can go? And it's not to say that venture is not a necessary thing, or in some situations, but we should have alternatives.
Yes, totally. I think venture is necessary. I think it's particularly necessary for certain types of businesses that have a lot of R&D, that aren't going to have revenue for, a few years, that really need the runway because they're working on a big, hairy problem. But I think we need alternatives, because the reality is most businesses aren't going to become Google, and I don't think we should push every business to try to become Google. I want to live in a world where there are lots of different types of businesses that are doing lots of different types of things. Yeah. And I don't think we have a financing structure right now that supports that.
Yeah. What would you say? So you've run a couple of businesses. What's the purpose of business in community?
I think the purpose of business is to create economic value in a community where you're operating. I think that's what's incredibly powerful about businesses, and to create jobs, good jobs with benefits, and to provide people with kind of a livelihood that is sustainable for them and their families, and can create wealth for them and their families. That was kind of my goal in getting into business, and so I think the financing structures that we have right now don't necessarily allow for that.
Yeah. So the STEP Fund, you launched this 10 years from now, 15 years from now, the emergence of this new asset class. Because I've heard folks across the country starting to talk about this, and we're seeing new inklings in communities across the country, which is awesome and exciting. where does this take us as a nation, as a financial economy? What hope do you have as this comes on board? What numbers do you think we are hoping to change as it relates to access to capital for specific communities? What are you watching and targeting?
I mean, I would love to live in a world where we had a set of entrepreneurs that were much more diverse, that were getting funded. I think more importantly than that, I want to live in a world where those entrepreneurs are creating businesses that are incredibly successful, where they own the vast majority of the business, and that they themselves can then become investors and invest in other people that look like them. And that's the power of Silicon Valley, I think, is that you have people who have been able to take capital and create these big businesses, create a huge amount of economic value, and then their employees and the founders can then go on to become investors. Now, those investors are largely white men, and those employees are largely white men. And so if we can diversify who actually has that opportunity, I think it could be really transformational for our world.